Welcome. So glad you all could join us for this webinar. This is an opportunity provided by the Master Gardeners, the North Fulton Master Gardener organization. And tonight we're going to be talking about trees. While some of the things we talk about will make good sense for other kinds of plants, this will focus especially on trees. So we welcome you to this webinar. As we get moving through here, we certainly want you to know a little bit about some of the housekeeping suggestions we have. You see them there in front of you on the screen. Attendees are asked to mute. That ensures minimal background noise. If you want to ask a question, just click on the Q&A box. And I think everyone may have a slightly different way that shows up depending upon the kind of hardware you're using and also perhaps the brand. But I think you'll know how to do that if you've been on a different kind of Zoom before. And we'll pause probably about midway, maybe a bit more than midway, and again at the very end to answer the questions that you post on that Q&A box. So we will try to get to all of those and try to have within the hour enough time to give the best answer that we can. This class is most appropriate for the growing conditions in Fulton County and the surrounding communities. We tend to think of this as the plant growing zone number 7. There's a little bit of difference of opinion among experts about whether we are in 7 or 8. Sometimes I think it all depends upon how close we live to the Chattahoochee River. If you're north of the Chattahoochee, you're probably 8-ish. If you're south, you're probably a bit more 7-ish. And we hear different experts talk about 7A or 7B. But just be aware that as you think about trees and going to a nursery and asking for the person that's about to sell you the tree, if it is in good shape for 7 and 8 growing zones, that they should be able to answer that question. If they hesitate, then my suggestion is you will want to make sure that you do your own research as you consider if this is the right plant, the right tree especially. You should always consult with the county extension office in the area. They will know if by chance the nursery you work with does not. They will know that. And they will probably know it about the particular tree, in fact. This presentation is being recorded. It will be posted afterward. So if you're just desperate to learn more about trees one more time, you can always go back and you can take a look at YouTube or Facebook, and you'll have a link to get to each in the follow-up email that will come to you. Don't forget to fill out the survey at the end. We want to know what you think about this. Anything at all about it you want to tell us, including me, and also any suggestions you have for future classes. You'll see a list of future classes at the end, and we want you to think about whether there's something missing for you. Who are the Master Gardeners? Well, it's a group that you could be a part of. We would love to have your interest in this if you're not already a member of it. But it is an organized, incorporated group within Georgia as a nonprofit 501c3 organization. That's an IRS designation. And of course, also we're incorporated in the state of Georgia through the Department of the Secretary of State as a nonprofit corporation. All volunteer organizations, that's the kind of group we are. Our purpose is to provide horticulture and education to its members and to the people of Fulton County. So we very much have in our minds serving the public well. We assist the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Service in Fulton County by providing this kind of education through a series of free classes that we'll highlight shortly. We'll see what topics are there to be covered. And again, you may have suggestions about that. We have North Fulton demonstration gardens where you can actually go and see how different kinds of gardening techniques work and hear from good, experienced people who have been doing this a long time. Children's gardens or children's garden classes are important to us, as perhaps down the road in these difficult pandemic times when schools reopen, we'll be back into some schools helping with setting up of gardens. We also provide horticultural scholarships, and we hope that if you have an interest in that or know of someone who might, that you will be in touch with the people in the extension office because they know the details and the latest information about that scholarship information. The series that we have, as you can tell by this screen, shows that we've already accomplished a spring vegetable gardening event. We've already talked about growing lavender. You would be surprised how many people love to grow lavender along with perhaps other special herbs. Now we're ready for right tree and right place, and we will get to that right away. But you will also see under that the other different lecture series that we have planned for this particular season. And you'll notice that coming up fairly soon, about not quite 2 weeks away, the hostas, and that you will find to be a fascinating discussion of one of the most remarkable plants. I've never seen a plant that has that much leaf diversity and an absolutely almost foolproof plant with just a few caring efforts. It's a remarkable plant, and you'll love that one if you tune in. And as well for the rest, as you'll see on down the list. Don't forget that you need to register for each class separately. That's one way that we understand and know how many people are registering for each of these opportunities. You can follow us on social media. That's the thing to do these days. And here you see a list of the various social media links that you can use to get to us. If you, for some reason, don't have these down or maybe forget what they are in the course of this, just remember North Fulton Master Gardeners, NFMG.net. If you Google that, just that, NFMG.net, you'll find the other links to all the other places, so not to worry. So there is, you have in front of you me, Tom Redmon. My wife and I have lived in the Georgia area since the, believe it or not, early 70s. That tells you a little bit about how old we are. And it also tells you that we're familiar very much in the gardening that I do in our yard with this particular plant zone area. I've been gardening ever since my dad taught me to plant different plants in the right places. And so that's been part of my upbringing botanically, I guess you would say. And there you see some of the other involvement that I've had over the years, and for a little over 10 years now with the North Fulton Master Gardeners. I get excited about this, in particular trees. I will tell you that my interest is without a doubt related to the impact that trees can have on the environment itself and the climate. Trees are an enormous and powerful organism. Trees are said to be, and I see no reason to doubt the research, that trees, for example, in the redwoods or the sequoias of the California area, coastal area, are some of the largest living things on Earth. You might think of the whale, but trees are bigger and heavier. So trees are quite something else in this world we live in. And I think a lot about that a lot of the time. In this particular case, for this particular webinar, I would underscore the last sentence in this little point, this biographical point. Choosing the right tree for the right place is a great advantage to the homeowner. It's a great advantage to the homeowner. It can help make a house just perfect. Or if not done well, it can make people standing on the street wondering who planted that there. So my hope is that this will be of help to people as we begin to make good decisions about picking the right trees. So what are we going to talk about tonight? We have 6 things we want to cover. These will slightly overlap, and we'll be talking about maybe an earlier agenda item later on. But generally speaking, we want to talk about how to select the right trees. Shrubs are important to consider because in some cases, people consider a very large shrub to be the equivalent of what they're looking for if someone said you need a tree there. It's possible that a very large shrub could serve the same purpose. We'll focus mostly on trees, but some of this will relate very well to large shrubs as well. We'll want to consider the site. What is it about the place where we want to pick a tree to put or to transplant that makes sense? How do we prepare? What do we do? We probably know enough to get the right tools to do it, but what do we do with those tools to make sure the tree has the best advantage? Best advantage for the homeowner. Then moving trees and shrubs to the right place. It's one thing to go to the nursery and buy in a sense, brand new tree, one that's been, of course, planted for a while, and it can be fairly small, but it can also be upwards to 8, 9, 10 feet. It's important to realize that that's one way to do it. The other way is that someone may find that they have a tree on their yard and it's just not in the right place. It's not in the right place. They may have made that decision themselves just from the visual concern they have, but they may have also had someone else, maybe with some expertise, to suggest that that tree really ought to go in a different place. And so there's a possibility of moving trees just as much as there is the possibility of easily going and finding a tree at a nursery. And then there is the place, the medium, the environment in which the tree is planted. And for us, not many places on earth can do without soil. Soil is a remarkable thing. There are those who have written literally histories of civilizations based upon the changes or the types of soils around the world. Something to think about, and a great way to do some research on just how important soils are. We'll speak very directly to the kinds of things that you need to think about when you think about actually picking the site and utilizing the soil that you have where you want your tree. We also want to talk a little bit about, now that it's in the ground, now that it's growing, now what do you do? It's possible to take a good look at it, think, well, that looks nice. I suppose that's all I have to do. Well, to tell you the truth, if you just leave it there, it'll do pretty well on its own, but it may not do what you want it to do. And so some careful maintenance and some careful pruning, especially pruning, is a way to give good care to a tree and let it serve the purpose that you have where you want it. Finally, we'll touch on a few interesting trees to consider. Of course, there are hundreds, and we will only touch on about a half dozen. But you have plenty of resources that we'll explain at the very end where you can go take a look at trees growing in their place with plenty of information. The real reason for talking about a few trees is to give you an idea of the kinds of characteristics, the kinds of descriptions of a tree that you ought to think about as you consider picking or moving a tree. So that's our agenda for this evening. As we start, we want to always be aware that there is good research about where we are and what kind of place trees will grow in this area of the country. We have to be aware in the Atlanta area that we have average high temperatures. That can make a difference. And we always want to be aware of what the statistics about average temperature, average monthly rainfall, and then of course the typical temperature ranges for plants. And that's where those zones come into play. And if we have those three pieces of statistical information, high temperature, average monthly rainfall, and what the zones will tell us is more of the low temperatures, the average low temperatures. If we have that kind of information, we'll have a lot of good atmospheric statistics to guide us as we plant trees. So let's first start with site consideration. Before reading these short topics, subtopics, take a look at these 5 good pictures. I won't ask you at the moment to say, don't unmute, but I think it won't take very long for you to answer the question, what's wrong with where these plants are planted? You might have more than one answer, which could very well serve as excellent, important information about where you want to put a tree. But I think from this kind of picture, you can see that mistakes get made. And so that's why it's important to think about what's to your advantage as a homeowner about how you want to pick and plant a tree. There are short-term issues, issues such as the kinds of immediate construction traffic, vehicle traffic on the root system of a plant, the kind of immediate events that may be going on around the plant that you want to be aware of. Where is it? Is it in the front of the house, the back of the house, and so forth, or on the side? There are long-term issues. The size of the plant that you put in the ground may or may not look like what you put in the ground in about 10 to 15 years. It's always important to think about what's the mature size of a plant and what is it going to look like. And then finally, of course, the aesthetic fit. Is it a plant that gives some added value to the way a structure, typically a residence, looks, and the place that it's planted, and whether or not it creates so much debris from leaf fall, or whether it's a conifer, evergreen, and whether that suggests a lot of needle fall. There are all kinds of things to think about whether the fit works aesthetically with the kind of structures that it's going to be close to. So let's take a little more detailed look now at the ideas of planting, which is the very first thing you would do once you have picked a plant. We'll talk about the kinds of plants in just a little bit, but let's first of all talk about things that make an important difference for any kind of plant that you would pick. In most cases, homeowners are going to be going to a nursery if they're going to get a new plant, and they're going to find one in some kind of plastic bin of some sort. It could be probably up to about a 5-gallon container, maybe more, a little bit more. Let me urge you to be very careful. So from a simple physical danger point, don't hurt your back. Let the folks who are used to dealing with picking up and dealing with large pot plants Do the lifting and pushing. Very important, because I've known good friends, and this has happened to me as well, where I just didn't quite have the strength that I thought I did when I tried to pick up that 10-gallon conifer from the weight of the tree itself, plus the roots and all of the wetted material around the roots. So once you've been careful yourself physically, working with them, then begin to take a look at the roots. I see, and I'm with lots of people who go to a nursery and say, that looks good, that's really good, that's a great tree, that would look good where I want it. And they have forgotten not only to think about the future mature growth pattern of the plant, but they forgot to say to the person selling the plant, would you pull that plant out of that bucket and show me the roots? If you come across a place or a person who doesn't want to do that, be very careful about what you're about to pick or have brought to you. When you pull that root bound pot out, you're going to begin to see something like these two pictures. It's probably important that the roots look a little bit on the light or creamy side, simply to show that there in fact is some good growth taking place and that it's not so been in the pot too long. The second slide shows that it's got to be able to be pushed around. There you see some roots that look a little old as you push dirt around a little bit. So be careful what you see in the pot, not just above the pot. There are several tasks involved in planting. These should make good common sense. You want to make sure that the plant is growing straight up, that the pot has not been turned on its side against a wire fence where the main stem or the trunk has grown vertically, but the pot's turned sideways, and so therefore all the roots are going in a strange horizontal place. You want to be sure that there is going to be some soil around the plant. In other words, if you need to add soil around the plant, you've got to be prepared to have the soil to add. Most likely it's the soil that will come out of the hole that you dig that we'll talk about in just a minute. But you do need to be aware that you need some amended soil or the soil that you just took out of the hole. As you press down a little bit once the plant is in the ground, be sure to remember to remove large air spaces. It's important not to jam and force hard clay against the roots and against the basically the root ball that's in the ground, but you want to make sure that there's not a large air pocket where either small voles or moles could get to and eat roots, or whether other kinds of different kinds of diseases could begin to eat away the quality and the life of those roots. You want to be sure that there's an ability to water the plant thoroughly. You don't want it so far away from a water source or a sprinkler source that it can't get water in the early stages. You don't want to fertilize. Do not fertilize. Fertilization is basically for grass and for small plants. Trees do not need any kind of fertilizing, especially at the beginning. They will get all they need just being in the ground and getting used to the ground around them. Mulch is important around the plant, out away, but the suggestion that master gardeners have based on good agricultural science is that you should not have mulch pressed up against the stem or the trunk. Most of us have seen other yards, hopefully not ours, where there is a mound, a kind of a vertical mound from the ground up about 2 or 3 feet away to up, and then piled up right up against the plant itself. Don't do that. You need to give a little space, let's say 6 inches for almost any plant away from the trunk. About 6 inches would give enough space for there to be air, to keep various kinds of fungi from beginning to build up on the bottom area of the trunk, and it will give the plant a much better way to grow. You also want to make sure that the tree knows where the ground is. If you build up the mulch this far, right up here is where the tree might begin to think that's where the ground is. So some beginning roots might stick out down in here. That's dangerous for the plant. The roots have no ability, once the wind blows that mulch away or it's scraped away, the roots have no ability to find their way back down into the ground. It's also important to remember that you've got to keep good trees watered for the few weeks, at least after planting, and really on through the first 6 months to the year, depending on the size of the plant. Trees have a unique root structure. If you look at this black and white picture, you'll notice that the roots extend in many cases for many trees much further out than the actual canopy of the tree. If you were to take a picture straight down on top of this black and white picture, you would see that you could see roots far out and away past the circle of the canopy itself. Those are the roots that are not deep, deep within the ground, but they actually help to keep the tree upright, to keep it in good shape through windstorms, especially hurricane winds. And it also helps the tree to actually find the amount of nutriment and the amount of water that it needs to grow. Most usually, if root growth is worried about, that is to say, if you're going to be planting in a place that's kind of hard caked or has had construction traffic in an area out beyond the distance of the canopy, you may want to till the soil, probably down at the most 6, 7, 8 inches. Active roots, as this indicates, stay typically within the top foot of soil. The point here is to promote root growth into the surrounding native soil. You've got to give the tree roots a chance, and that's what this one is all about. Planting the tree requires thinking about the hole. After the tilling of the soil, you want to dig down the hole for the plant about 3 to 5 times the diameter of the root ball. By diameter, we're talking about this area right here, all the way across. That's 1 diameter. So you can see this has gone 1 and 2 diameters out further on both sides, all around. You don't need to amend the soil. Remember, trees do much better if they have chances to get acquainted with and using the soil that's around them. Notice that in this particular hole, there is no digging way down here, no digging way down here and then filling this up with loose soil. And the reason for that is you want this root ball of a tree to sit firmly on solid ground. The roots are not going to go down this way. The roots are going to go out, out and out, up here, close to the top, and maybe a little bit down in here. And this little bit of a trough is another advantage to keep water from amassing up around this root ball. If this line of hard soil, undug soil, was to simply be cut this way across like that, you can imagine that all the rain that might pull in here would fall right down here and start to flood this area of the root ball. That's not good. Roots typically, for most plants, not all, but for most, roots typically do not like to have their feet wet all the time. If by chance the tree that you buy is what's called a balled and burlapped tree, one that is wired up in a cage, kind of, if you think of 2x4 wire, that means that the holes in the wire are typically about what you could pass the end of a 2x4 piece of lumber through. That's a wire cage typically. And there may be also burlap around that to keep the soil from falling away. In that case, You want to be sure to remove the burlap if you can, and to cut the wire cage in many places around it so as not to hold up a large root coming through. And don't forget to fill the hole with amended soil. What is the soil that we want? Well, here's the soil that we will never find. It's perfect. This is perfect. What do you see here? About 40% of minerals, 25% water, 25% air, all mixed together perfectly. You won't find that. You want to get close to it if you can, or as close as possible. And you want to make sure that good soil has some airspace for drainage and root growth. Now remember, not big pockets of air, but simply airspace within the little pieces of soil for there to be this drainage. It needs to be able to hold water in a reasonable way without causing the roots to be sitting in water all the time. Mineral matter that provides the right chemistry is important, but for most trees, that's going to be available in the regular soil. Organic material to promote soil, supplements of various kinds that can improve soil texture are always available to you and can be used as you need to, but not so much to take the place of all those opportunities to find the regular soil. Here's some examples. North Georgia clay soil, which some people might think is just awful. It's all that red clay that sticks to your boots and shoes, and just the kids drag it in. It's probably a tremendous a kind of soil to retain moisture and to contain a lot of inorganic nutrients that you otherwise would have to buy fertilizer for. So clay soil is extremely valuable as a kind of soil. It has some disadvantages in that it doesn't share the moisture very well. You have to chunk up other things in it to give it a little bit more of air passageways for water to get around and about in the soil. Sometimes it's very hard if it's been dry for a long time, and you probably know what that is if you've had cars running across a construction area. Root growth is difficult because the roots, the ends of the very delicate and most effective roots will find it hard to get through that tough kind of clay soil. Once the root is developed a good bit, it can begin to push its own way. But early on in a tree growth root, it's going to have a difficult time pushing that little meristematic end of root out into the places where the best possible ways of getting water and nutrients can happen. It also has less organic nutrients. That's all that mulch and all that kind of manure and all that other stuff that you think of as being a more organic oriented material that you would find in dark and black soils or loamy soils. And also there may be very few soil organisms. For example, you may not see many worms in a very hard clay soil. Worms, of course, are natural, just absolute perfect natural fertilizer producers. They do it all day, all night, all the time. So if you don't see any of those kinds of organisms in there that can decompose material and therefore make it available to plants, that's probably because you've got so much clay. One thing to be careful about if you try to improve it, don't replace it with topsoil. Topsoil is not what the roots are used to, and topsoil, even though that may look like what the local nursery has been able to get the tree to grow from seed to where you're buying it, you want your tree to begin to get used to other kinds of soil where you got it. You just simply place topsoil on top of the original clay soil, and you'll find that all of the good things about the topsoil will gradually, by gravity, simply get down into the clay soil. Peat moss is good to amend it, but be careful about using too much. If it's all peat moss and not enough clay soil, you're gonna find it drying out. And if those roots dry out too much for most plants, those roots will become unable to transmit and to allow the tree to get its proper amount of water and nutrient material. So use peat moss carefully, mainly to break up the clay soil, not to displace it. If you do use sand, don't use the kids' play sand. That's too fine. That's too perfect. Yes, the kiddies may have peed in it, but it's still just too good for this. What you want are just some plain old bags of gritty, inexpensive, coarse material that you typically would get if you wanted to mix up some cement. So if you do decide to use it, don't spend much money on the fancy, fine play sand soil. Now let's finally, before we stop for a moment, let's look at watering. Watering trees typically only needs about 1 inch per week during the season, that is the growing season. Typically in this area, the growing season for a tree, the serious growing season, is going to be from somewhere in March on well into September. Once established after the first year, most shrubs and trees can exist for a few weeks without watering. Think about that. Your lawn may not be able to handle that kind of watering routine, but your trees certainly can, because they have an extensive root system and they have much more capability of finding water deeper in the soil. You'll notice there are a couple of exceptions that I've had homeowners suggest to me about when they're worried about their hydrangea and their rhododendron. Hydrangea, of course, is much more of a shrub. Rhododendron can be a small shrub, but if you've been into the mountains of North Georgia, you've seen rhododendron growing 30, 40 feet high. So I would classify them as at least looking like an interesting tree. Those kinds of plants do need much more water most of the time. When you water, water deeply. You want to promote deep rooting. 1 or 2 times a week, depending on the rain. You have to remember that while the roots are near the surface, they're not on the surface. They're not like grass, which is just right there in the top 1 inch or so. You want to be sure that you at least water down so that you get water on down into the ground at least 4 or 5 inches, which means watering deeply more, but no more than 1 or 2 times a week. Don't water frequently or lightly. I've seen people go out to their yard and go to their favorite tree they're trying to grow, and they've got 5 minutes before the game starts, and so they sprinkle it. Sure enough, it looks nice and wet on the top, but the water, it probably did not go down but an inch. Guess what those roots are going to do? Those roots are going to start to turn up rather than down. And you do not want the roots up on the top of the ground in a hot Georgia summer. You can use a nozzle, a wand, you can use sprinklers, drip irrigation, which is highly valued because it does not waste water sprinkled into the air and therefore somewhat evaporated before it ever hits the ground, especially in the summertime in Georgia. Finally, water at night on or before 10 a.m. to reduce fungus. There's a great advantage of the tree during the daytime having time to dry out, if you will, especially the trunk and the leaves and the branches drying out, therefore much reducing any kind of fungus risk that you might find. So let's pause for a moment And I think you'll see there on the right side some of the, again, reminders about the social media where you can find good information. But let's see if there's a question so far.
Hey, Tom. Yeah, we have quite a few questions. So let's start with the first one, which is, what is considered to be North Fulton? I live in Southwest Marietta.
So North Fulton, you might consider anything close to and certainly north of the Chattahoochee River. I hope that makes sense. But you also could consider that you might consider 285, Interstate 285, as another example of a dividing line. Even though you might not think of anything south of 285 to be anything but south, I would say you could be pretty sure that if you're north of 285 and especially near the river or above it, you're in North Fulton County.
Perfect. Do you recommend loosening up the roots before planting a tree, or just put it in the hole?
It's much preferred to loosen it up. You don't have to knock all of the soil off of the roots. Although you can, of course, as you will note, you can buy very carefully packaged bare root small trees from good nurseries. That's easily possible. But in most places around in the big box stores or even the big box nurseries, you're going to find good sized root balls in proportion to the size of the tree. And so it's much better to try to simply pull the roots loose from the outside edges at least. One careful thing to look at that you might have seen in that slide, but be careful about it. If you find the roots going around and around and around when you pull it out of that plastic container, you want to make sure that you get all of those roots that are round and round pulled out and away and make a space for them in the hole. You may have to dig a little tributary away from the hole just to give those roots a place to go.
Okay. Should I add a quarter red clay in my yard?
I'm sorry, a quarter?
Should I add a quarter red clay in my yard to garden soil?
It's hard to imagine having to add clay soil to any soil north of Macon, Georgia. But if you do, you can probably pull it from some other spot in your yard or some kind of ravine or ditch even, or exposed ground where good quality clay soil can be found. As I say, it's unlikely that you will go down very far, even if you're in an almost foresty sort of area in your yard. And if you go down past 3 or 4 inches, you're probably going to hit some clay. Now, it is important to chunk it up and to, as we said, till the soil down to no more than a foot, maybe less, just to get any kind of heavy clay chunked up into the higher up topsoil.
Okay. Next one. Speaking of worms, why do we find worms after a hard rain on the surfaces of the patios, and what does it say about the soil in the area?
Right. Worms do not like to be drowned, so they typically on a hard rain go up to try to get out of the really wet situations they're in, and many of them somehow find the roads to be just about as dry as they can find. They forget about the robins and the automobiles, but they do try to do that. But worms like to be in soil that's not solid clay. They like to be able to get around to eat most of the organisms in the soil and to turn it in at the other end into some of the best fertilizer you could possibly find.
Okay. Why don't we take one more, and then we'll finish up at the end and take all of the rest of them at the end.
Sure.
Should we fill the hole with amended soil or unamended soil?
So filling the hole requires soil that is loose enough for new roots to get a good start. That may be the best way to put it. In some cases, you may be in a place in your yard where you've got such good loamy soil so far down that you really don't need to worry about the kind of clay that might stop that. The main thing is to till up enough to be sure that you're giving the roots within about the top 8 to 12 inches at the most of a not too big tree, a chance to really get going. Once they get going, the structure of the root itself can become so strong that it can get through a lot of tough ground. You've probably noticed in a couple of places, or have known people who've had their sidewalks buckled upwards because of the strength of roots coming up under them.
All righty. Okay, we'll catch the rest of the questions at the end of the webinar.
Great. Yes, please ask questions. And I'll pause just in terms of questions to remind you, master gardeners don't always know, not every master gardener knows the answer to every question, but we do know each other, and sometimes we know how to find the right answer. You have tremendous resources, not only in this dispersed group of wonderful volunteers across every county, or most every county, especially in Fulton County and North Fulton County and the surrounding counties. And you've got lots of people who have specialties. So you can always count on us to be able to sometimes link that up. If we don't know, then the agricultural extension agent, who is the paid expert for the county and whose office is here on the Roswell Road, North Fulton Annex Government Building, we can get you in touch with them, and we'll have a phone number for them at the very end here. And they can either get you in touch with us, or they can get you in touch with the right resource. And then, of course, there's always the Googling that can take place with this tremendous agricultural division at the University of Georgia that has a good paper, well-researched, lots of experience on just about every topic you can come up with. Okay, so on now, just to move ahead as we get closer toward the end, let's talk about this maintaining, what it takes to maintain a good kind of tree and a habit. Here's some examples of something. In some cases, you want a tree, and I'll use my pointer here, to go up. You don't want so much side spread as you want up. And so pruning becomes a way at various points to try to get this tree to understand what it is you want it to do in terms of its growth habit. If you want it to spread more, instead, you might be interested in cutting out some of the tallest pieces of it. When you prune, you always want to prune with it's more typical to find a slicing prune that does a better job rather than what's called an anvil, which would be a kerchunk. The blade hits a flat surface. That's an anvil cut. Rather, you want more of what you might think of as a scissors cut, heavy duty, of course. And that's what you probably find here. And you cut very close to a node or a bud on a branch. Here you'll see that instead of just jumping in quickly and saying, well, there's a bud, ka-whack, right across there, you want to cut sort of diagonally so that the top of the diagonal is above the bud. Where the bud's coming out on this side, you want the angle to be up so it does not cut the bud. Those buds are the apical meristem pieces of the growth of those branches. Same thing over here for a bud, that kind of movement. There are different kinds of pruning. In most cases, two kinds are most important to us in our typical homeowner landscaping situations. We always want to thin out if we can, because if you look at this tree and consider that inside the tree, there's so much branching in here that cool air, and in fact, there's so much opportunity for damp fungus related disease to get going. And so you want to get rid of some of these internal branches to kind of open this up, give it both a natural shape, but also to open it up. So you see, this is the suggestion about thinning out, the purpose of any kind of good pruning. Now, there's another kind, and by the way, this is what you would see if when you finish that, that it has a nice shape, still has the nice shape, but there's more air space in here. Breeze can get through, air can dry out, and therefore give less chance for fungus to begin to build up, and for bacteria, and for various kinds of mold that affect trees. In one other way to do this is to begin to think of a loose tree with lots of cuts at the very top, and so that begins to look like that you are trying to get more canopy on the very top of the tree. If you head back, this is the second kind of pruning to suggest. If you head back, what you're trying to do is to remove the end section of the branches at the same height so that the new shoots begin to make the plant thicker. This you see right here, all the thinning is taking place not in here, but out on the edges, the end. You want thickness up there. This is how it would look with some thinning inside, a little bit of that, but also with the heading up at the top. One danger, when it begins to get this much heading pruning going on, it's going to create lots of foliage on the outside. Yes, that looks fine, but remember that on the inside, you want airspace and the ability for breezes to get through and for some drying action so that no fungus takes place inside that tree. Now, how do you prune? It's a simple but so misdone process. If you invite someone to come out and limb up your tree that's already growing well, maybe a big tree, maybe a foot in diameter, but you've got a limb sticking out toward a big window, or the squirrels are being able to jump directly from that limb to your roof and into your attic. So you got to get rid of that limb. How do you do it? You could find a limb such as this one that maybe that's 4 inches across. Well, first of all, don't do it yourself. Get some help, depending upon the size of this right here. If you can't do it with one hand, it's too big. My wife would never let me do more than about an inch cut of limb right here. Also, here's a good point. I want to put in a quick plug for checking with your potential tree people when they come out. Make sure that they hopefully actually have on their staff and at the site someone who is certified as an International Society of Arboriculture, arborist. Typically, they're referred to as an arborist, but you can't tell that unless you say, are you ISA certified? If they say that, then you've got a pretty good chance they know how to do all this for almost any kind of situation. And oh, by the way, they can climb the tree. So let's look at this for a moment. Here's a place where a limb has been cut off. This is correct or incorrect? The answer is incorrect. The reason it's incorrect is because the right place for a prune is right outside what's called the collar. The collar is an area of bark and vessels that are rich in all of the various growth hormones of the tree. They're also hormones specifically designed for a tree to help make sure that the integrity of the tree itself, the trunk here, or the big, if this is a big branch, that the integrity and its ability to ward off insect and other damage is also transferred almost in concentrated form here, so that if a windstorm broke this limb off, the tree would be able to do something about it. If you cut it off, if you're the wind, don't cut it out here where insects could get to this area and fungus and down and deep into literally the xylem and phloem tissues of the tree and could kill the tree over time. Out here, you want to make sure that the cut takes place just outside the collar, this collar of material right here that you can tell almost on any size trees, small or large. You can easily see this. Now, how do you do this? First, and you don't see it right here, but the first thing you do is you make 3 cuts. The first cut you make is on the bottom of this limb out further, somewhere out here. And you want to make a cut about, a third of the way through. Not all the way through, just about a third of the way through. That's the first cut. Second cut is to come back in closer within probably about a foot of the trunk here and literally cut off the tree. That takes the weight off. The limb, cut off the limb, takes the weight off. And advantage of making that first cut right under here is that if this limb were to crunch and fall this way, the bark would not strip down the side as it sometimes does and pull off the outer protective bark. Sorry, let me go back here, missed that. So then once you have just a foot of limb right here, then depending on the size, of course, you can easily come back and make the third cut right here, right on the outside of the collar, and your tree is in as good a shape as it can possibly be to protect itself. Now, what do you need to be careful and think about in terms of pruning? First, do it in late winter before the spring budding. You might have tried to prune a tree limb off of a river birch, and you cut that limb off, and all of a sudden water just poured out in April. Well, sure enough, that just shows you how powerful the forces, the sucking, so to speak, forces, that's not the correct word, but it's kind of a sucking up forces are to get water up to the top of that river birch. Better to do it in January. In this area, I would suggest getting all these things done in January, because you never know how February will be. Aren't we in February, and isn't it 70 degrees right now? Next, prune lightly after transplanting. Don't prune heavily. It's important to give the tree enough leaf area to be able to transport all of the needed material that the roots need to grow down. Consider future plant shape that you desire. In other words, get standing way back and start taking a look at what you want that tree to look at, and don't just go straight into it close up to make your tree pruning. Cut the individual branches rather than shearing off the top. You remember we talked about the heading at the top versus the individual inside cutting. Dispose of cutoff pieces. Once in a while, you'll find a tree with diseased branches. You don't want those on the ground where the disease will get into the ground. And again, don't leave the leaf litter near the plant. It's always good to rinse tools in antiseptic. I hear people use Lysol. I hear people using, I can't say it. It's not alcohol. Well, alcohol would work as well, but also the other one. It's like alcohol. We keep it on our shelves. I'll say it in a minute. Now, I think that's enough on the pruning. That gives you a sense of who to call and what to do, how to do it. Let's look at a few trees. I want to go through these not in detail, but to suggest that they are trees that in Georgia have been proven to be extraordinarily pretty trees, and they do well in our area of the country. But the main thing I want to point out is look at this list of the kinds of descriptive activity that you should look for in this particular tree. And one way or another, by calling Master Gardeners or by calling the Extension Service or by looking at good books or talking with good people who know plants, you'll find this kind of descriptive material that can help you understand, I can't do that here. I need a 40 or 50 foot tree. And I'm not sure about, this should be feet, by the way. I'm not sure if I only want a 15-foot width tree. I need something wider. It's going to be in a big open space. And you then see the other parts of the description that will help in this choice of tree. This is a beautiful, the fringe tree is beautiful. Hornbeam is a wonderful tree because it's strong. It's a very strong tree, by the way. A lot of people have thought that this tree is second to a flowering pear tree. Pear trees are not strong trees. It's fairly lightweight wood. They all come, almost all the branches come from one spot, and a good windstorm could really strip this tree in some ways. In a hornbeam, you don't have that problem because the wood is so hard. It can last a hurricane. But you also want to think about other kinds of details, whether or not you have this kind of setting. Obviously, you don't want full shade. So other characteristics make a difference. Texas red oak, if you need a big, fast-growing tree, is pretty good around here. Don't forget that there are a lot of oaks, a lot of quercus, but there's only one Texana. As I say, this is the species name. This is the family. This is the species, and you want to make sure that if you go to buy one, it may say Texas red oak on it, but you want to make sure that it also has this name because no other tree has that scientific name, where it's possible that other trees might be a red oak grown in Texas. So again, watch these different characteristics as you choose good trees for this area. The last comment would be on the redbud. Redbuds generally do so well in Georgia, any kind of redbud, but in a special way, the Canadensis is a remarkable, almost specimen tree that is just intriguing and beautiful to look at, both in its limbing structure as well as its weepingness of the branches. And of course, it's beautiful in the spring. So there's some good examples of good trees. Where can you find out more information about this? Well, let me first of all say, don't forget this telephone number right here. You can Google it, of course, and find it, but that's your extension office number, and it's a way to get in touch with Master Gardeners. It's a way to get in touch with the expert who's there on staff, and it's a terrific resource. Whoops, went too quickly. There are tremendous advantages of looking to see what's available in the University of Georgia Agricultural Extension Service. You can see it at the bulletin number 600, bulletin 1000, and just think of all the kinds of subjects that could be covered here. It's remarkable reading, well done, well researched, and it's a great way to go directly to that information without having to go through waiting for a phone call. So great references for a great university system here in Georgia. So let's stop and see if we've got some more questions.
All right, sorry, a little slow there. Is a crepe myrtle a tree or a shrub? There's lots of questions on crepe myrtles. I've had mine for 4 years and it hasn't bloomed.
Okay, so here's my answer. How many times have you run over it with your lawnmower? If you've run over it 2 or 3 times, it's probably still a shrub. Now that's a funny answer because as you have noticed in some places, a crepe myrtle can be a beautiful tall tree going up to 40, 50 feet. Now I will admit I have a not so much an appreciation for what's referred to as crepe murder. And that's when the top of that tree, remember heading? Remember when we talked about heading? It's what I do to the top of my head when I get a haircut. I just walk it all off. A crepe myrtle can be done that way. It will create knots in which there's the opportunity for fungus and mold to grow as the new stems grow off. but it does keep the crepe myrtle a small shape and almost a kind of a bush-like picture. There are also some crepe myrtles that are really more shrub-like, and you can get those and run over them with your lawnmower. They'll still come back because it's a great tree or shrub, either way. It's just that I think they are one beautiful big tree if you can give them room and let them grow.
Okay. And while we're on crepe myrtles, what is the best time to plant crepe myrtle trees?
Probably, again, like most other trees, it's going to be in the late fall. There's a chance there for, or for that matter, early spring, and by that I mean no later than February. A chance for the tree to go in the ground more as a dormant material rather than a tree right in the middle of trying to grow, and all of a sudden you yank it out of where it was and put it in a different place and tell it to do this. Much better for the tree to have time, especially for the roots, to get used to the new soil and the new situation, the sun where the sun is, the shade where the shade is, and to start getting used to its new place prior to the time of blooming. For crepe myrtles, for example, you really ought not to expect
Tom, you're frozen.
Okay, well, we seem to be having some technical difficulties, so I'm going to continue to ask the questions, and our two master gardeners, Sandy and Lee, who are on with us, will answer them. Let's see. Along the lines of what we were talking about, when is the best time to plant a tree if you aren't able to plant it in the fall?
Yeah, I can take this. This is Sandy. As Tom was saying, as early in the spring as you can, February, March, those are really the best months to plant. If you absolutely insist on planting it in April or May, you're going to have to water a lot and make sure that it's not drying out and it's well mulched. I certainly wouldn't plant anytime during the summer.
Okay. Do trees or shrubs benefit from coffee grounds or eggshells?
Well, eggshells tend to make the soil a little more alkaline. So if you have a tree that likes that, let me back up. What you really need to do is get a soil test. Get a soil test before you plant a tree. You can get that test through the North Fulton County Extension Office, as Tom had mentioned. Just bring in, take some sample, 2-3 samples of the soil, 4 or 5 inches below the surface, maybe in 3 or 4 areas around where you're going to plant that tree. Put it in a little bag, take it down to the extension office, and there you can transfer it to one of their little soil bags. You'll need about a pint of it. And they will analyze it for you. They'll tell you what the pH is and all your major nutrients that you would need. If you need to add anything, they give you this really wonderful report that tells you exactly what you need to add to the soil in order to grow the tree. You'd want to fill out the label such that you're saying what kind of tree that you're going to plant there. Now, coming back to, the coffee grinds will make the soil a little more acidic. The eggshells will make it a little more alkaline.
Awesome. Okay. If we have large trees whose large roots have been disturbed by deep construction, is there anything that we can do to improve the tree's health so that there's less of a risk to fail?
Oh gosh, that's really going to depend on the tree and how severely the roots have been damaged. I guess keep it watered, try to cover the roots back up, what's left of it, and then just hope for the best. We had some road construction done outside of our subdivision recently, and there were some beautiful, what are they called now? They're trident maples, and they cut the tips of the maples that were actually on the others. The maples were on the inside of the homeowner's fence, but they cut the roots on the outside of the fence, and it was enough to kill the tree. So, every tree is going to be a little bit different in terms of how much it can withstand, but root damage was certainly a great way to kill a tree.
Okay. I have a crepe myrtle in my yard that I inherited last year. The previous owner severely pruned the tree, which is not too bad, but it also has a bad case of powdery mildew. And they left leaf, branch, and debris all around the tree. How long does it take for a disease like that, or how long does it remain in the soil?
Gosh, I'd have to look that up. I don't know. Maybe Tom would know that, but I would have to. We'll have to get back to you on that.
Okay. Let's see. My property is not flat. Where can I find out about trees and shrubs that do better on a hillside? Or is this important, or will any tree do?
I'm not sure, but I don't see any reason why it wouldn't grow so long as you can keep it watered. Obviously, on a hillside, the water is going to run off. So you're going to have to make sure that when you first plant the tree, that sufficient amount of water is being retained around the tree to allow it to soak in, maybe mounding up one side of it so that you temporarily have a dam area so that the water will truly soak straight down instead of just running off. But otherwise, I can't think of any reason why any tree wouldn't grow on a slope. I mean, you see it in nature all the time.
Okay. What should we do about erosion exposing of the top roots of old and large trees, or probably any trees? Really, that's a good question.
Well, a lot of trees, if the roots naturally exposed, you do not want to cover them. You can cover them lightly with mulch, like pine needles or pine straw or mulch, but you don't want to cover them with soil. It will smother the roots.
Okay. Doesn't watering at night promote fungus growth in grass and trees and I guess garden flowers for that matter?
Yeah, I think pretty much everything you want to water in the morning.
Okay. Okay. Can you propagate sweet olive shrubs from cuttings?
Oh boy, that one I don't know.
Yeah. Why don't we ask one more, and then we will work to get answers for any unanswered questions and email them out to everyone who registered for the call. Will municipalities take on the cost and responsibility to cut down damaged or diseased trees within a certain distance of public roads?
Wow, that's a fight you're going to have to fight with your individual city. And so I really, you're going to have to talk to your city.
Okay. Great. So there's quite a few other unanswered questions. So we're going to wrap up here just to be cognizant of the time. We will answer the rest of these and send them out. Don't forget that the next webinar is a perfect addition to your shade garden, and that is Sunday, February 21st. So we hope to see you there.
Thanks, Mary.
Bye.